Hello, everyone. Welcome to my discussion post for Module 6. I'm Victoria, and today we'll be discussing whether a return to the Fairness Doctrine is a good idea, why or why not. So, in my opinion, I don't think returning to the Fairness Doctrine would necessarily be a good idea. I think it's good in theory, but the reality of it is, I feel like it's not very relevant for today's climate of journalism. So, first and foremost, fairness doctrine was first introduced by the FCC in 1949, and it was to promote balance and diverse viewpoints on controversial topics in broadcast media. The policy was about contrasting viewpoints and ideas and making sure at the time that more than one perspective was shown. The doctrine began to become more phased out around 1987 because critics had believed it was outliving its usefulness. It got to the point where it started to impede a little bit on First Amendment rights because journalism in and of itself started to become more diverse as a whole. So it almost became a redundant policy in a sense, and it got to become a bit of an imposition more than something that allowed for diverse viewpoints. So the return of the fairness doctrine in the modern sense would be even more obsolete because as time has went on, journalism has become even more diverse than the 80s. So what this policy tried to do is already happening in a sense, where you have a policy that is setting regulation around diverse thought. It's almost the antithesis to what's happening already. So traditional media at the time was a bit more rigid. We've seen in a Western climate a lot more writers over the years. As social media has become more relevant, we're seeing even more diverse streams of consciousness from so many people, not even in the Western climate, but globally as well. And there's a necessity that we have to make sure that these diverse trains of thought are able to be heard and that there's not too much regulation set around the opinions that are being shared. Whereas it's not as much of a necessity today to implement, you have to talk about the other side of context, with issues, because it's already being done on such a massive platform already. Another talking point in terms of why this policy may not be as relevant today would be the access that people have to information. Whereas, again, because broadcasting and media was so early at the time, there weren't as many platforms for people to access news. Therefore, in the very select spaces that it was shown, it was very important to also show opposing viewpoints or to show more than one side of the argument because there weren't as many places where the conversations were happening. In today's media, in today's journalism climate, there are so many places to access various news sources. There are so many different news syndicates that exist, period, from print media to digital to traditional news that comes on television. It's just not as rigid. Another talking point, going back to the First Amendment, is definitely a very relevant conversation within this. And censorship is a very relevant conversation within this too. One talking point as this policy was being voted upon in terms of continuing it was, is this in fact something that is reducing the discourse that journalists are able to have and are able to conduct within what they're writing? And journalists and broadcasters were very concerned about self-censorship or avoiding controversial topics because of the policy regarding fairness doctrine. The question became, well, we may not be able to say this, or we may not be able to dive into this conversation without being hit with the regulation of this doctrine. So when we discuss the First Amendment, when we discuss medium and journalism, these are always very serious talking points in terms of making sure that writers, creators, and journalists have the space to truly communicate what it is that they are trying to communicate. So in conclusion, I would say because of today's modern context with information sharing, with journalism, specifically the internet, specifically social media, the internet has connected people globally, from local news to mainstream content. There's so many different layers and variety of niche, so many more diverse syndicates in general. I think that a lot of things are fortunately happening that this policy initially had in mind to help cultivate. So I think re-implementing it would be almost a bit counterproductive in the 2025 context. All right. Thank you guys for listening. Y'all have a great rest of your day.